Girl Talk Apologetics. My name is Patty Trotty, joining you from East Central Indiana. My co-host Ann Sands hails from sunny California, and she and I are both very glad that you're here for the special Q&A with Paul Gould, the author of Cultural Apologetics. Paul, welcome, and thank you so much for taking time to join us.
Thank you, Patty. It's great to be here with all of you. Look forward to our time together.
All right. Well, we know that you're the author of Cultural Apologetics, but what else about you or your work would you like us to know?
Okay, good. Yeah. Probably the most important thing about myself is a follower of Christ and a husband and a father. And so married to my wife of 30 years, actually celebrated our 30th anniversary this past summer. We went to Athens, Greece, and that was a lot of fun. Not just the walking in Paul's footsteps, which was super meaningful, but also the philosopher in me. Got to go to Plato's Academy, which was like the first university in the West. Got to go to Aristotle's Lyceum, which is another really important thinker in the West, a philosopher. And so, yeah, just great time celebrating 30 years of marriage with Ethel. And then as we were chatting earlier, we've got four now grown kids that are between 26 years old and 18. And so we're now empty nesters. Our youngest just went off to school. And so we're adjusting to life with our kids at a distance. So yeah, apart from that, philosopher by day, but just love to pursue the good, the true, and the beautiful, and really grateful to get to do the things that I get to do.
All right. Well, thank you. And congratulations on your anniversary.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
So the way we do this is that Ann and I will take turns reading the questions that were sent to us by the women who participated in our discussions. And then we will eagerly anticipate hearing our author answer the questions.
Okay. All right.
All right. First question was sent in from Valerie, and she asked, can you please elaborate how joyful play points beyond to a world where all is it should be, the good triumphs over evil, and everyone is known by his or her true name? In addition, would you include what might be categorized as playful behavior in animals, both wild and domesticated?
Yeah, I love this question. This is such a great question. So thank you, Valerie, for asking this. So I'm so glad that that Patty sent me these questions ahead of time, because you guys were asking very precise and deep questions. And so it reminded me, this particular question though, reminded me of a book that I read more recently by Jared McDermott, who's a theologian. And he wrote a book that is called Everyday Glory. And in there, he kind of walks through, he's talking about sports, but he's talking more generally about play. And there's a whole host of things about play that actually I think are signs of transcendence, as I talk about in our book. Let me just list five. He lists eight, and I'll list five, and I'll try to be sort of quick about it because I won't take a lot of time on this. But for example, when you think of sports or when you think about play in general, there's this idea that it's a kind of free creation. Thinking about when my kids were young and we just sort of played in the backyard, and it was a lot of times it was make believe with my boys. It usually involved sticks that turned into little guns and things like that. But there's a kind of free creating that's going on there that's that points to the kind of creating that God does, that God didn't have to create, but yet he freely created this world. And it presses like these really interesting questions in God's case, like why did he create if he didn't have to, but yet he did? And I think the answer is something like to spread his joy and delight. And so this kind of free creating that we do, imaging the creator God, points to this deeper reality that God has created us as image bearers who create in the derivative mode as we follow the creating God. So play is a kind of free creation, number one. Number two, play is unnecessary. Sometimes they call play a liturgy of the unnecessary. And it's a liturgy in the sense that there's a kind of order to the games we play. We make up rules, and then we live according to those rules, at least when we're playing the game or things like that. But it's also unnecessary. We don't have to play. It's not essential to life in the same way that we don't have to be. We're not essential to life. We're contingent. And so this unnecessariness, a lot of theologians have pointed to It points to the contingency of life in many ways. We play, we don't have to. We exist, we don't have to. And so life is a gift. Play is a gift, and it kind of points us that way. That's the second thing. Third thing that McDermott talked about in that book when he was giving us like 8 things that I really liked was the idea that he talked about sports having their own time, and I think that even when we play, it has its own time. But I'm mindful of we just finished the World Series, and those innings and those games they go according to their own time. We don't ever know if it's going to be over in 3 hours. Some of those were record lengths. So too with any game that we play, they kind of have their own time depending on how long, like in tennis, a match would go or things like that. And when you think about the church as well, the church has its own time. And when you think about even God, God has its own time. Sometimes we find ourselves in these waiting moments. And I think that in the same way that games kind of have their own time, it reminds us that we are under God's time and that God has his own time and that we learn to wait on him. So that's the third thing. Fourth thing about play is, and you see this most clearly in sports, but I think you see this also when you play like with your kids, just make believe, is the idea that sports involve winners and losers. And we love to compete. Often we don't always win, but we seek to win when we play often. And in the game, ultimately, it doesn't usually mean much, But what's interesting is that the Bible does have a real important category for winning. The idea of winning is actually a biblical idea. And so you see this with Christ, that Christ has achieved victory over our sin and victory over the devil and things like this. And one day we will have victory from sin and death and disease and all of those things. And so it does sort of prime us and remind us that there is this ultimate triumph in the game of life. And then the last thing that I think play reminds us of is gratitude. And this gets back to in fact, one person has said about sports that it's simply a grace, a minor grace, that relieves the weight of life. And I think that's true about play as well. It's a simple grace that relieves the burden of life. And it's the same way that Tolkien talks about fairy stories that are a kind of heroic escape that give us relief and then consolation, and then we can enter back into prime reality refreshed. I think that play does that in the same way. And so adding all of that up, I think that play in general reminds us of these deep truths about God, it reminds us of deep truths about ourselves, and it reminds us of deep truths about the world that we find ourselves in. They provide moments of escape, recovery, delight, joy, and I think they remind us that we ultimately take our place in God's good world. So yeah, play, if we kind of think about it theologically, I think does illuminate a number of truths about God and the world. With respect to animals, yeah, I think that it's, again, this kind of, we see these sort of moments of grace where animals, they don't necessarily work the same way we work. They just, spontaneously play. And again, I think this is a kind of image of the kind of giftedness to life. Maybe animals can enjoy in ways that we don't because they don't have some of the burdens that we carry as creatures with intellects. So yeah, I think there are interesting analogies with animals as well. So I'll stop there on that one, but that's a wonderful question.
That is a wonderful question and a great answer. I don't think I saw any of that in the question, Valerie. So I'm really glad you put that up.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
All right. So this is a question for me. When you found out that the Purdue philosophy students who moved towards belief after rewriting their worldview paper were nonetheless apathetic about the existence of God, how did you respond? And did you change your approach from that point forward when you presented the evidence?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, okay, good. Yes, I did change my approach in at least 2 ways. I think that as a trained philosopher, I'm very comfortable giving arguments, and I like to give arguments, and we should. Any apologetic worth its salt has to show the truth of the claims that we, the faith that we hold dear. And so it's good and right that we give reasons for our faith. But I realized, I think in that moment, as early on working with students, is that we need to combine head and heart. And so I think it did begin to change my approach a little, where I cared not just about ideas, but I cared about image and moving the heart and the loves and the passions and the things that drive us. So yeah, it did just sort of reframe how I think about presenting the case. I wanted to show, and it eventually, I kind of landed on this definition of cultural apologetics, that we want it to be not just true, show that it's true, but we want to show that it's good and beautiful as well. That it's true to the way the world is. That's the reasonable part, but it's also true to the way the world ought to be. That it satisfies. So the second major change though that it did, I noticed, like, I do a lot of speaking, kind of travel around and speak on college campuses, and a lot of times they'll ask me to come speak on some apologetic topic. Does God exist, or why does God allow evil and suffering and things like that? And I used to just give your standard kind of rational explanations for these kinds of things. And I've changed my approach in this way. I've noticed, and I do this now all the time, whenever I give a talk like that, to an audience that would have non-believers in it, I always pause and say, would you just consider for 20 minutes, just for 20 minutes, the possibility that Jesus is better than you've been told? And I find that kind of just pause, and then I say something like, consider the possibility that Jesus actually satisfies the deepest longings of your heart for meaning and for happiness and for joy and for love and for peace and things like that. And just setting that expectation, I think, has actually been really helpful, because it invites people to have this genuine posture of openness, and it kind of lets down their guard in a way, because it is an appeal to the heart in a way, I think, as well. And so I've kind of reframed things differently. I still think we need to give reasons, but we do it as embodied humans, and maybe this is that's how I've sort of reshuffled a little bit.
I'm going to take a note from that for when I talk to my unbelieving family.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah. All right, the next question is actually a combination of two questions that were sent in by Kristen and Valerie, pertaining to how Christianity is perceived. A footnote on page 152 says, paying attention to how Christianity is perceived is important. That was Kristen, struggle in my own perception of our faith because of self-identified Christians in my life who prefer to keep their faith at a very fluffy level. Valerie says that the universal moral facts of the intrinsic value of human persons and the duty to neighborly love are being eroded even by those who profess to be Christians by the approval and use of hateful labels for certain people and the narrowing of the definition of who is our neighbor. So first, how do you think Christianity is generally being perceived in our nation and globally? And how would a cultural apologist respond to someone whose observations make it appear to them that Christianity is no longer good or desirable, even if it used to be?
Yeah, great question. So in the book that you all read, I began with Christianity's image problem, and the claim there was that we've lost the Christian voice. Christians are largely anti-intellectual and out of touch with the relevancy of Jesus to all aspects of life, and so nobody wants to hear from us. Not just that, we've lost the Christian conscience. We're just as fragmented as our non-believing brothers and sisters. Weekly, we read of Christian leaders who disqualify themselves from ministry, and so as a result, the church is no longer able to play the prophetic role that she's historically been called to play, to be salt in a decaying culture, to be light in the darkness. And then, of course, we've lost the Christian imagination and this idea that Christians basically describe the world the same way everyone else does. We use words like everyday or mundane or ordinary, but that's not the way the world is. Biblically, the world is enchanted. It's sacred. It's gift. It's creation. It's mysterious. And so the claim there was we have this image problem in those three ways. We've lost the Christian voice, the Christian conscience, and the Christian imagination. And as a result, the gospel is no longer viewed as plausible and desirable. So that was in 2019. Since then, I've done a little digging, and I've kind of pressed on this question: what is the state of Christianity's image? And as it turns out, I think it's much worse than what I said in the book. When you look at the statistics, I think I can categorize it in three ways. We have a backdoor problem. People are leaving the faith in droves. If you look at some of the studies that are coming out, it's something like 1 million people who today claim to be Christians leave the faith every year. In the next 50 years, we'll lose 42 million people who today claim to be Christians. for every one person that converts to Christianity, 4 leave the faith. And so we have this backdoor problem right now with Christianity. We have prominent deconversions, and we could list them, but these are fairly high-profile deconversions. Some of them are Christian heroes who are walking away from the faith in very public ways. So we have this backdoor problem. We also have this front door problem. If you look at the statistics, especially as you get down to Gen Z, Gen Z is sharing their faith less. They no longer think a decreasing percentage of Gen Zers think that it's our responsibility to share our faith with others. And an increasing percentage of those think that it's actually morally wrong to try to convert someone to your own view out of their own. And so the result of all of this is that we're not sharing our faith. There's a study that I think Barna did about just asking U.S. churchgoers what the Great Commission is. And of course, the Great Commission is the last words of Jesus in Matthew, where he commissions the disciples to go and make disciples in all the earth. And it was something like 17% even know what it is. And no, it's actually like 6%. And then, half have never heard the phrase. Another quarter have heard it, but they don't really know what it is. And so we don't even know what it is that we're supposed to be doing often. And so there's this front door problem. So back door problem, front door problem. But then the house itself is in disarray. We're morally fragmented, we're intellectually fragmented, we're politically fragmented, we're sociologically fragmented, we're racially fragmented. I mean, our social media behavior is incredibly bad. And so the house itself is in disarray. And so if you add all of this up, I think, so the question was, what is, how do people view Christianity nationally and globally? I was thinking about it today, and I think that probably nationally Christianity today is perceived as political or politicized. We're perceived as cultural warriors, and I'll speak to that in some later questions because that's important. And I think we're probably perceived as unloving. That's my. If I were to summarize how I think we're perceived, at least nationally, I don't know exactly globally, but I suspect it's similar. With that, then that second question, well, what do we do then? We're someone who thinks that Christianity is no longer good for the world and things like that. I would make a distinction between the Christ followers in Christ and of course point people to Christianity and kind of the truth claims of Jesus. So I would point them to Jesus and the gospel. I still think it's important, though, that we can show that how Christianity is, in fact, good for the world even today. And we have cases that are interesting. I'll just point to one here because so that I don't spend so much time on this question. Think of the case of Richard Dawkins. You guys are probably aware of this, but in 20 years ago, when new atheism was all the rage, you had someone like Richard Dawkins writing books like The God Delusion, where he claimed that Christianity is dangerous, destructive, and delusional. Now, fast forward to 2023 or 24, within a year, he now says that he is a cultural Christian, and maybe some of you have heard this claim. And what's so interesting about that, he still thinks that Christianity is unreasonable and false. He doesn't believe it, but what he's realized is that it's good for culture. So here you have this arch nemesis of the gospel or Christianity, but suddenly he finds himself in the UK, and Europe in general, that's being sort of overrun by secularism on the one hand and perhaps Islam on the other hand. And he realizes that, no, Christianity actually is the thing that I want, at least culturally. So you can actually, anecdotally like that, but you can actually point to hard facts where Christianity is, in fact, today good for the world in terms of human rights, in terms of bringing relief to the poor, and on and on and on. And so that's kind of the posture I would do with that question. So. Great question.
There's also some evidence that Gen Z is taking another look, at least very recently.
Yes.
So,
yes.
At least.
Yep.
This question comes from Ella. She says, I am a Christian apologist who was born with a physical disability. And my apologetics niche deals specifically with disability. The broader culture of disability community includes both Christians and non-believers who tend to be heavily postmodern and progressive and lean into liberation theology. What is the best way to engage a culture that imagines even God is disabled?
Yeah. Hello, Ella. I love this question too. This is a great question. I would just say three things to at least, get this going. The first thing, as I think about your question, is don't forget, and I'm not saying that you do, Ella, but don't forget the question, why do you think that? That is like, we so often in apologetics receive and accept the burden of proof. But if someone's making claims that, Jesus has autism or God is disabled, I think the most natural question that I would want to ask is, why do you think that? And notice you're shifting the burden of proof on the person making the claim. And then you can begin to apply all the skills that we've learned as apologists and thinkers to the response that you're given. So that's the first thing I want to say is, especially in this area, never forget that question. Why do you think that? Secondly, though, I think it's important to remember that this issue is fundamentally cosmological, or to use the more proper term, it's metaphysical. It's about the nature of reality itself, and of course, that includes the nature of God as well as fundamental reality. And so, part of what I think is relevant here, and even in your question, you hinted at this. There's postmodern thought, there's anti-essentialism. It's like in our own thinking, let's return to the quote great tradition. The historic view of the world that is now called the great tradition, the first 1500 years of Christianity, where the idea was that reality is ordered, it was teleological, it was rational, and it's of course one unifying story, the divine drama, and things like that. And that leads to my third and more technical point to your question, is that philosophically, and I think you know this, but the battle is over essences and something called realism versus nominalism. That's kind of what's often going on in these kind of ideas is there a way the world ought to be? So historically, we had this concept of human nature. So humans have essences or natures, and those determine our ends, how we ought to flourish. And so for the tradition, there was this distinction between human nature as it is and human nature as it ought to be. And we are creatures on a journey toward fulfillment. And that was the traditional way of viewing the world. And so the virtues were necessary to live a life. And we could talk about what those virtues were, but they were that kind of the things that would help us on the journey and to journey well. But now there's this battle over whether or not things like essences or natures exist, and especially in the areas of gender, race, and disability philosophy. There's a new project going on in metaphysics. So my specialty is metaphysics. That's what I teach. I teach metaphysics as the philosophical study of reality. And when you engage the literature, especially in those three areas, there's a revisionary metaphysics project that's going on. It's sometimes called an ameliorative project. And the goal of ameliorative metaphysics isn't necessarily to describe and seek truth. In fact, the idea is that certain words, when it comes to race, gender, and disability, are oppressive. And so we need to revise our concepts and sort of conceptually engineer these terms so that we could alleviate some of the oppression that's taking place. So there's actually in those three areas specifically, a whole trajectory of thinking in metaphysics that undergirds the things that you referenced, nominalism, postmodernism, this ameliorative project. And so even just to be aware of that, I think would be helpful as you try to navigate through this. And so we could talk more about that offline, but there's some really interesting things going on.
I think she was happy with your answer.
Okay, good.
All right, the next question is actually mine. This book club, Girl Talk Apologetics, was actually birthed out of frustrated attempts to engage the life of the mind in community. Many of us still face frustration over intellectual and theological laziness in our local churches and social circles. Apart from our own personal study of scripture and church history and the works of our Creator God, how can we as lay people help others recognize that intellectual and theological laziness is sin and encourage them to engage the life of the mind?
Yeah, the question, the struggle we all have. Yes, I'm with you on this question. My answer, it will be three words and then some practical ideas. The three words are be, tell, and show. Be, who are we? We're disciples. And what are disciples? You know that you guys know this. We're learners. That's literally what a disciple is. And so would we be men and women who are followers of Christ, who are learners, and that love God with their minds? So be. Tell, encourage others with your life and with your words. That we're called to love God with all of our being, the great commandment, or even spiritual formation. Think of again, you guys know this, but I find these passages so convicting in my own journey. Romans 12:2, where Paul puts the mind front and center in spiritual formation. Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Look at the example of Paul in Acts. Paul demonstrates intellectual virtue, especially I love the Paul at Mars Hill, the passage in Athens in Acts 17. He demonstrates intellectual virtue and things like that in such powerful ways. So be, tell, and then show. I would say one thing that we can do, apart from just like talking about this all the time, is just show them the benefits of a life that is more robust intellectually, that where we love God with our mind, because you become more interesting as a person, I think, and you live a kind of wise life. Like if we have this wisdom deficit in not just culture, but Christian culture, and we have this opportunity to live wisely. That's the chief of the 7 virtues, was wisdom. And wisdom is knowing the grain of reality, so it requires our mind, but then living according to that grain. And so we can show them with our life well lived. So those would be the 3 words. But I too have this question. Everywhere I go, I see the same struggles that you guys see. So what are some practical things? I'll just throw out a few more on that. What you guys are doing is a great example, starting a book club. My wife, we moved here to Florida. We live in a place called Jupiter Farms. She's a reader. We're all readers. And she just started a book club on Facebook. And now they're like her best friends, and they're all non-believers. But she has this great conversation every month, and it's rich with gospel connections. And so just start a book club is so great. We do that in our church too. We read regularly as a church. And that's actually a great way to kind of press gently, find a good book that awakens imagination, but also the mind, and then have those kind of conversations. So make it normative in your church if you're able. Suggest it to your pastors, or your leaders, if you're in that kind of a position. But there are other things too. There's so many opportunities locally, depending on where you guys find yourself, to invite your friends to apologetics conferences, to conferences that show this intellectual side of Christianity, this sort of more robust view of what it means to be human. Take advantage of those. And then if you don't have access to apologetic conferences locally, you probably there's opportunities for fellows programs. Think of like the C.S. Lewis Institute, and they have a year-long fellowship. Think of the Colson Fellows Program. They have a year-long fellowship where you're connecting with like-minded people. And then finally, just continuing to share all the resources online. You guys are generating good resource in your own ministries here, but there's so much of that wealth. And so just pointing those out to people, I think at least those are some practical things that I've tried
Thank you.
with
That's
you guys.
encouraging and informative. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this next question is from both Valerie and myself. You wrote that typically a person is understood to be the kind of being that has or is an intellect and will. On the other hand, an impersonal mind, we might suppose, is a type of being with an intellect but not a will. Can you please elaborate on why it would be the case that an impersonal mind would have an intellect but not a will, particularly if, as you said, it would want to bring perhaps about a certain state of affairs?
Yeah, I love that. Such a great question. And it forces me to clarify. I love that. So intellect and will. So a traditional view of what a human person is that we have these 2 faculties of the soul. I would say characterize them that way. So the intellectual faculties, what we might just call the mind, are where our mental life resides. And so there's powers of reasoning and powers of longing that primarily are found in the intellect. So we reason and we desire, and therefore we have beliefs and desires or wants, but that's all in the mind. The will is the volitional capacities of the soul to act. And so they're powers to act. Without the will, we can think and we can want all day long, but we can't act on those willings. I'm sorry, we can't act on those longings. And so that was what I had in mind. I hope that helps a little bit. That's what I had in mind. This conception, if I recall, this was probably in the discussion about the moral law, if I remember. But the idea was, suppose you just had an intellect without a will. It could want and it could think, but it could never act. And that's kind of what I was trying to press. So hope that helps a little bit. That's what's going on there.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
All right, our next question comes from Kristen, and she says, one of our discussion questions for the section on fragmentation was, what are some of the challenges to keeping a positive posture toward culture, and how might we overcome them? I find it increasingly hard to keep a positive posture toward culture, and I'm wondering how you would answer that question.
Yeah, another great question. Okay, I'd say 3 or 4 things. Number one, look to Christ, because otherwise we'll get discouraged no matter what. So just, I'm mindful of, is it 16, Psalm 16, 8 and 9. It's a great passage that I've been meditating on this year. But it begins with David proclaiming, all day long I keep my eyes on the Lord. With him at my right hand, I will not be shaken. And notice then in the next verse it says, therefore my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices and my body rests secure. So there's actually this connection between fixing our eyes on the Lord and like peace from anxiety. And that's partly why I've been praying it, because there's things you get anxious in life. And so just reminding ourselves of the importance of fixing our eyes on the Lord daily. So that would be the first thing. Another thing that I found helpful is just to remember that the culture and those in culture are not our enemies, strictly speaking. In many ways, they're victims if they're people that are doing things wrong. The real enemies are the devil and sin and the flesh and things like that. And just to kind of remember the nature of the battle, that it's a spiritual battle that we're on. And I think that helps relieve some of the pressure when we see people do things that are evil. We remember that in some ways, these are victims that need saving. They're not actually the real enemy here. And so that would be the second thing. Maybe the third, maybe the last thing I would say here is that, so this is going to sound weird, but have courage and hope. And so I've referred to this a few times, so let me just fill it out here. So the virtues are super important for life. And classically, in like the ancient Greek world, they had 4 virtues, and these were wisdom, and they're ordered this way too: wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. So wisdom is knowing the truth about reality and then living according to it. Justice is organizing your life around the good, and I would add, as Christians, the good that is God. Courage is third in line, because you need to know the good to protect the good and to ward off evil. That's courage. So that was part of my claim, that we live with courage. And then temperance is kind of moderating the internal passions. But then the church added to these 4 cardinal virtues the 3 theological virtues, and that became the 7-fold picture of what it means to flourish as a human. So you guys know the 3 theological virtues because you find them in Scripture: faith, hope, and love. And so that's like the 7-fold picture of the virtuous life. And faith is helping us to see the path. And hope is that which sustains us on the path toward God. And love is that which we journey to. And so the claim that I just made now, given that 7-fold picture, is that we would have courage and hope, that we would have courage to protect the good and to ward off evil. And then we would have hope that sustains us on the journey, because part of what hope is, what's so cool about hope is that that's the only virtue that we won't take with us into the afterlife, because in the afterlife, all of our longings will be satisfied, and we will no longer need to have this posture of hope, because we'll have all of them. So that was my last claim, that we journey with courage and hope in the midst of the discouragement.
Thank you for that.
It was beautiful.
Yep. Thank you.
So this question is from Beth. She says, if cultural apologetics points to God as the source of meaning and transcendence, how can we use those insights to engage a culture that's losing its sense of what is truly good, beautiful, and true? How do we recalibrate the culture?
Yeah, that's good. Another good question. I'm going to just reference you all to a book that maybe you're aware of, but I find Andy Crouch's book, Culture Making, very helpful. In there, he talks about how the posture that we should have. So he defines culture. So what is culture? I think that the definition of culture that Andy Crouch lands on is the one that I would go with. Culture is what we make of the world. If God if the world is what God made, culture is what humans make of the world. And we make by being artists and gardeners. So we literally make culture, and we recalibrate to the question that Beth asked. We recalibrate by cultivating the good and the true and the beautiful that's already found in culture, and then making stuff, literally making things and stories, the meaning we make too through stories and art and literature that embodies the good and the true and the beautiful. So if we want to change culture, we need to make culture, because that's all culture is. It's what we make of the world. And so what that means is we have this conviction that humans are created to be nourished on the good, the true, and the beautiful. That's how God has made us. And as artists and gardeners who create in the image of a creating and cultivating God, we too are to make things and to make meaning in the stories we tell that cultivates that is evocative of the good, the true, and the beautiful. So I would just point to that book and this idea that we image God, and in imaging God, our primary posture is to be artists and to be gardeners. And I mean that in the widest sense of the term, artists, that we cultivate the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Thank you.
Yep.
That's a good recommendation.
Yeah.
All right, our next question comes from Valerie. She says, in the section on external barriers, you use the discussion on homosexuality as a model in which to address other social concerns such as race and poverty. How does your discussion on homosexuality translate to discussing issues of race and poverty?
Yeah, good. Okay, because there's so much more that could be said. And that, what is the model? And this is pressing me because I wrote this book a long time ago. But the model is something like this. Number one, we need to understand the traditional view on the topic at hand. What's the traditional biblical teaching on poverty? What's the traditional biblical teaching on what was race? What's the traditional biblical teaching on homosexuality? So we start there. That was the first step. The second step then is, okay, how is this traditional view at odds with the consensus in culture? What's the tension here? And so we want to understand theology, biblical theology, and then we want to understand culture, and we want to notice the tension points when it comes to race or poverty or homosexuality or whatever it is. It could be gender, it could be so many things. From there, once we understand and take our time to really understand the biblical teaching, and then we understand the tension, I think the third question that we would ask ourselves are, what missteps have we made as Christians that have contributed to the view that the traditional view is no longer viewed as plausible or desirable? Because this was part of the discussion where the Christian ethic is viewed in culture as unloving and repressive. And part of my surprise and part of my claim was that I lay the blame at our feet. Why is the Christian ethic largely viewed as unloving? It's largely because of us. We don't understand or have a robust theology of these things anymore because we're anti-intellectual. And we don't actually understand the beauty and the goodness of these traditional ways of thinking about these different ethical issues. And so the third claim was then we need to understand what is our role in contributing to this view of the traditional teaching as unloving. That would be the third thing. And then the final thing in terms of the model that I was after there is then, okay, what are the action steps? How can we actually actively work to re-establish the traditional Christian ethic as reasonable and desirable? And I think for me, what I've learned from this book, and I could tell you all the things that I've been from when I wrote that book to what I've been learning about it now, I think this is always going to involve sort of re-understanding the sacramental nature of reality, and whether it would be human persons and the dignity that we have or things like that. But if we kind of understand the sort of value that we have as creatures, that's going to help. That's going to give us some practical action steps. So I was just kind of trying to map out a model like that to help us show others that no, actually these traditional Christian ethics, they're not repressive. They're not unloving. Maybe we've made it that way, but it doesn't have to be. And so how can we help others see that they're not like that?
So we have to know our own stuff well,
Yes, that's the point. Yes.
and see
Yes.
the beauty in it
Yes.
ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, details. Okay, so this is my question. In the chapter on imagination, you admit the difficulty of imaginative reasoning, making quote unquote thoughtful connections between theology and culture. Can you give us an example when you've seen this done well?
Yeah. I was talking to my students about this question today, and we could not, there's a good news, bad news. No, there's bad news and an opportunity here, I think. We couldn't think of anyone that's doing it apart from C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, who do it so well. Let me say a little bit more than that. I actually tried to do it in this book. This is my more recent book, A Good and True Story. So let me back up. When I wrote Cultural Apologetics, at the end of chapter 3, I asked this question: how can we join with God and each other and the Holy Spirit to re-enchant the world? And I gave two answers. We awaken desire, and then we return to reality. And when I started talking about returning to reality, I said there's two things involved. Number one, that we would see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And number two, we would invite others to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does. And those two ideas have become two future book ideas. And this book was one of the two future books. So this one was more recently published. This is a book written to non-believers. It's not a book about cultural apologetics. It's a book of cultural apologetics, where I do try to engage in that imaginative reasoning, where I take the readers on a journey and I use arguments, but I do it in a way that's creative and tell stories, and I pull from culture in all the ways that, like, you see the Apostle Paul do that in Acts 17. As an attempt to do the very thing you were asking about. Setting that aside, whether I do it well or not is, beside the point. I think there's a real opportunity here, because I could not think of many in the space that are actually engaging in imaginative reasoning. I can think of a lot of people in the art world that are doing good artwork, but they're not making arguments for God. Where are the apologists that are making arguments that are embedded in this beautiful connection between reason and romance? And I can't come up with any. So that's my sad answer. But the opportunity is, go and do it. You guys go and do it. So anyway, sorry about that answer, but we struggled with that one, thinking on that with my students.
I'm definitely going to read that book. I'm the only believer in my entire family. I'm one of 6 kids. I've got nieces and nephews up the wazoo, and it's unfortunate. So I am definitely going to read that and see if it's something that might.
Yeah, let me know. I tried. So not perfect, but that was the attempt, at least, and we need more of that. So, yeah.
Our next question is from Kristen, and this is about this section on internal barriers in the church. She says, one suggestion you wrote about is the need we have for more liturgies which help us form our habits and practices. Barna polls indicate Gen Z is being drawn to Catholic and Orthodox churches, and I'd argue that even Islam draws in youth with their liturgies. If you were leading a youth group, what kind of liturgies would you suggest?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm just going to share one thing that I'm really grateful for that I get to do every October is fly into Colorado, and I spend a week with gap year students for Summit Ministries. They're out of Manitou Springs, but they have a gap year program near Colorado Springs in the mountains. And what I love about going in October is the students have been there for a couple of months. And the way that the gap year program structures their day is highly liturgical. And so I step into this environment where every meal there is a liturgy. In the morning, they do a devotional and a confessional before breakfast. In lunch, they do a song and a prayer, and then at night, and then they do something different every night. And then after every meal, before they dismiss, they sing the doxology, and the students love it, and I love it too. Coming in, I loved it so much. I took it back the first year I did this. I took this back to Palm Beach Atlantic, where I teach, and I tried to make my students do it after every class, and it was very awkward because I can't sing. But that was my attempt, and that's what I would attempt. I would start with the doxology. Just find a place in your youth rhythm and add that and go from there. So yeah, so I've seen it work, and these are near high school students. They're 18 and 19-year olds, so they're a little older than your, freshmen in high school, but they love it, and they love everything from the confession to the doxology to the daily prayers to they have structured work time and structured reading time and structured study time. And so I would start with something small. And I would also not rely to the question. I would not just rely on the Sunday night, whatever night youth group meets. Sometimes a different purpose to that. I would incorporate or try to incorporate some liturgy to the Sunday night, but I would look to embed it in more regular times throughout the week, whether it's a small group. I assume that often, if there's opportunities for small groups and other kinds of meetings, I would lean on it more heavily there, assuming there's maybe a Bible study going on as well too. So I'm just sharing what I love at Summit semester, and I've seen the students thrive in that. And so I would start with some of those things and go from there. And they read from the Liturgy of the Ordinary, this book that comes from Rabbit Room Press with Andrew Peterson and those guys. And they'll often read those prayers, and they love it. So maybe start there.
Okay, so this question is from me. In the section on false reenchantment 3 neo-paganism, you refer to a kind of postmodern spirituality that embraces the experiential over the doctrinal, the occult over the divine. How might we as cultural apologists help cultivate imaginative longing that opens towards transcendence instead of that which closes inward toward elevation of the self and self-divinization?
Yeah. Let me tell you about one. So I have a lot of misses, things that I've learned since I wrote that book that I would change or I want to expand on. So the second book I want to write, the one about seeing and delighting in the world the way Jesus does, is a book for Christians. And that's the book that I want to write next. But to your question, what I realized is I talked about seeing and delighting in the world the way Jesus does. And notice delight is an emotion. If you look in the index, there's no mention of emotions in that book at all. And since then, I've learned that emotions are super relevant to our life. Of course they are. And as Lewis would put it, I think this is the right view on emotions. Emotions are like this quasi-perceptual faculty that helps us to perceive the value of things. This is Lewis's view. It's rooted in Aristotle. It's a classic view on emotions. And I think it's right. And so to the question, how do we cultivate the imagination and this so that it's open towards transcendence? By training the emotions and cultivating wonder. So let me just say something about wonder, because I think that's the lifeblood of all of this. Wonder is it's an emotion, it's an epistemic emotion of self-transcendence. It's an epistemic emotion of self-transcendent awe. And it involves two parts. It involves an encounter and then an invitation. The encounter is like when we experience the wonder of something like the Grand Canyon or the Rocky Mountains or a palm tree here in Jupiter, Florida, or just beauty, something beautiful, we experience the weightiness of the thing, and it awakens this sense of transcendent awe. And then as we experience the weightiness of this thing, it sets us on this journey to accommodate this new experience within our world. So we actually expand our soul and to kind of accommodate this. I love like Augustine in the Confessions, he says of God, he says, God, expand my soul that you might inhabit it. So, the wonder of God and that we need to enlarge ourselves in light of this. So what's so interesting, it's an epistemic emotion because it sets us on a journey to understand the experience and to reaccommodate it in this larger picture of reality. What's interesting, though, psychologists have noticed all these benefits to wonder, and two of them are what's called the small scale effect and then humility itself. The small scale effect is when we come into contact with these weighty things that awaken wonder, we actually literally believe ourselves to be small. So notice now the world, we can actually see the world for what it really is because we don't have our loathsome loathe themselves in the way anymore, given rampant individualism in the West. And then it literally cultivates humility as well, because we realize that we're part of this bigger reality, this bigger story ultimately. And so I would say we've got to be men and women that cultivate. If we want to see and delight in the world the way Jesus does, we've got to cultivate wonder and we've got to train our emotions. And I look forward to saying much more about both of those things when I get back to this book I want to write on reenchantment someday.
Right. Thank you. That's a great answer.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, the next question was mine. In chapter 7, you mentioned battling with teens about smartphone usage. Do you have a recommended general approach for dealing with secular liturgies in our homes? And would your approach be different for homes with no children?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think they would be different because we do have age appropriate things that you need to consider when you have kids, for sure. I think I would answer this. I'll just share one thought and then one thing we did with our kids as we were growing up that seemed helpful. The one thought is I'm coming to realize that there's two basic postures that we can take toward the world. And I think that the two basic postures, to use two simple words, are a posture of taking or a posture of receiving. I think that much of contemporary culture is this Promethean idea of just, either mastering the world through technology. That's sometimes just the techno-utopian vision of naturalism. Or there's this kind of blank slate and we can just sketch whatever life we want on it. And so we're taking and we're seeking our true name. But on the traditional view, the Christian view, actually, I would say it's one of receiving all things from God as gift and then stewarding that and then regifting it back. And so we learn to live a life that's a posture of receiving from the Lord. And so I would say that probably the most important thing is we have this posture of receiving. And that gives me the idea that every day I get up and say, Lord, just help me to lean, because it's about posture. Help me to lean in your direction. And there's real freedom in that. And there's real grace in that posture, because it doesn't mean that I'm perfect. It just means, Lord, help me to lean in your direction. And over time, we will grow. So that's what I think, that posture is actually really important when it comes to now technology. Because technology, of course, is something that we make of the world, and as much as we shape it, it shapes us, and it's not neutral. And you guys know this. I mean, if you read like Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Anxious Generation, those are children who have grown up with phones in their pockets are the most anxious generation in the history of the world. And they have attention fragmentation, they have sleep deprivation, they're depressed, and they don't know how to connect with others. They're lonely. And so what we did then, when our kids were young, and we learned this from our mentors, they still mentor us today, and we're close to their friends, their children, and then now their children's children. They're kind of like our extended family. Is we never had technology in the central places of our home. So the family room, no TV. It does now, but when our kids were young, we were very intentional to relate in prime reality with our kids. So we are a book reading family, and our kids love books, and now everybody reads, and we need to tell them to put their books down so we can talk. But we were very intentional on not making the television at that point, now it's phones, the center of our relating world. And then we just prioritize getting them out in nature. One of the real tragedies of the digital age is that young kids mediate their lives through a screen now, and they don't even know how to see the world around them. And so we've just been really intentional to kind of set these boundaries, especially when they're young with technology. I don't think we do it now. All our kids are older, they have phones, we all have the same struggles everybody else has, but at least we have this kind of reference frame that I think hopefully has helped them to be, a certain kind of person today. So it's a longer discussion, but that's maybe all for now.
And those would be good goals or principles for even just adults by themselves to follow.
For sure. Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you.
Good.
Okay, this question is from Kristen. You have mostly answered this, but I'm going to read it anyway because maybe the last part will be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Your book came out in 2019. Our world has drastically changed. What would you add to your book in 2025 to address cultural apologetics today? I think you've addressed that. Could you also address the problem of Islam that we now face?
Yeah, I actually love this question because it's true that culture rapidly is changing today. I mean, unbelievably rapidly. And there are things that if I were writing this book today, I would add, not just the things that I already mentioned. We would have to talk about technology and AI. We would have to talk about the rise of transhumanism and posthumanism. I mentioned that a little bit in the book, but now it's like front and center. You've got Silicon Valley Elon Musk, Peter Thiel. These are literally transhumanists who think that we can overcome the fall through technology. And so there's some real serious techno utopian visions that are in play today that weren't in play as much in 2019 because of the rise of the AI revolution. So I think I would talk more about that. I would probably also want to talk a little bit more about modern paganism. I don't know if you guys have been watching the trends on this, but paganism is on the rise as well. I'm mindful of, I think it's in the office. I didn't bring it home, but I'm thinking of like Tara Isabella Burton's book, Strange New Rites. The subtitle of that book is something like New Religions in a Godless World. I forget the subtitle, but she catalogs all these ways that we're trying to re-enchant the world in a world where there is no God. And so you have all these sort of new expressions and new kinds of religions that are forms of paganism in some way. They're not all that, but I would want to be more conversant with that were I writing this book today. And I plan actually to engage some of these things in that future work. In terms of Islam, I think that this is interesting, especially in Europe and the UK. There is a real Islam is a global player, and in the 21st century, Islam is posed to be the dominant religion on the world stage in terms of our geopolitical sort of things that are taking place. And so, what we need there is so often, I think, in apologetics, we have spent our time talking about atheism, and we have all the arguments for why God exists and why the atheist is wrong, and you can't have value, and you can't have rationality, and you can't have any of that stuff. And of course, all of that's really important. But we need to, especially for those who are called into those contexts, we need to have people that are engaging in Muslim apologetics. And there are people that are doing that in this space right now. And I think, and we're seeing actually that there's this talk of people leaving Islam because of these Muslim apologists who are not just showing the case for Christ, but showing the bankruptcy of the Islamic faith. So they're developing original arguments for the Islamic dilemma of something. If you can Google that, you'll see it's a new argument that's been developed by Christian apologists that's having a real life impact on Muslims. So we've got to, especially if you're called to those contexts where Islam is becoming a major player, we've got to be engaged in that as apologists.
That's good. All right, well, we are almost out of time here, but before we let you go, I wanted to ask a couple questions. You mentioned a new book that you're working on. You want to tell us again about that real briefly, and then also any other projects that you're working on?
Yeah, so the reason why I haven't got to the book that I told you I want to write is I have a current book project. I'm writing a philosophical theology text book with a friend named Ross Inman. And so we are knee deep and 3 years late on that book. So that book was due 2 years ago. It's now due in next September. So I hope to finish that. It's been really a fun project. I teach philosophical theology in some of the classes I teach. And so we've been writing on that. So I want to finish that. I'm also working on an anthology on the argument from beauty. It's currently at a publisher being considered where it would be some of the leading philosophers, atheist and theist, on this what I think is a neglected argument, the argument from beauty to God. And so we've actually assembled just a world-class group of philosophers who are going to engage that at a very sophisticated level. So Paul Copan, Dr. Copan and I, my colleague, will be editing that book. But we're really excited about that because I think beauty and art is this underexplored area, especially in analytic contemporary philosophy, and we want to really push that argument there. So working on that, and then beyond that, I did mention to you that I do hope to get back to. I have a book all charted out, ready to go on re-enchantment. So I want to turn back to this question of culture as soon as I'm able. I find myself I teach a lot. I lead an MA in philosophy of religion, which is basically that book on steroids. We go right down to the roots of the philosophy that undergirds all of culture, and metaphysics and epistemology and phil mind and phil science, and we build it up from the roots. But because of that, that's pretty intense. And so I'm having a hard time. I'm finding myself writing on the margins. But as soon as I'm able, I want to get back to the question of re-enchantment and really kind of fill some of those gaps. One of the interesting things about the book Cultural Apologetics is I wrote it for my kids and my kids' kids, actually, and thinking about when my kids have kids, what is the state of the gospel going to be in 20 years or 30 years? And that's why I wrote it, but it trended really well in spiritual formation and missions. And I found it myself really helpful for discipleship. And so since then, I've kind of been on this journey about, understanding our place in the world and this idea that we live in this sacramental universe. And so I have some writing I want to do there.
Sounds wonderful. And where can people
Yeah,
find
too.
your
Yeah.
resources, the ones that you already have, and then the future ones?
Yeah, you can. I have a website, paul-gould.com, that I kind of keep a running list of books that you can find there. And but you can follow me on all the normal, Facebook. I can't go on Instagram because my kids tell me I'm too old for that. But I'm on Facebook, and you can find me there. And you can Google me, and you can find me on my faculty page at Palm Beach Atlantic. And the last thing I would say is I do have a podcast called the Udo Podcast, where I flesh out a lot of these ideas. We just dropped season 9 on technology, actually. And the title of the whole we drop it like Netflix, we drop a whole season at a time, but it was Human Flourishing in a Technological Age, or no, the Future of Human Persons in a Technological Age. And we did address some of these issues there. But you can go to twotestinstitute.org, and you can see all 9 seasons of the podcast, and you can find the Udo Podcast wherever you get your podcast. So yeah, I'm pretty accessible online. Just find me. I'll be happy to chat with you.
Okay, so if we have questions about any of your books, we can contact you through your site.
Yep, you can find me there. You can find my email online at PBA, and I'd be happy to correspond with you. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you again so much for taking your time to answer our questions and interact with us. I think it was all very helpful and encouraging to us. And I just, on behalf of all of us, say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Patty. Thank you all. It was great to be with you tonight.
Thank you very much.
And ladies, if you want to stick around for a minute, Anne's going to announce our next book.
Okay, well, that was really wonderful, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So the next book, and it works out well, given what he just said a couple of questions ago. No God But One by Nabil Qureshi on Islam. So the subtitle is A Former Muslim Investigates the Evidence for Islam and Christianity. And you may be aware that Nabil Qureshi is no longer with us. So unfortunately, we cannot have him for a Q&A with the author. However, I have confirmed that the man who led him to Christ and also does Islam apologetics, David Wood, will do the Q&A with us, which is a score. And the book is actually even dedicated to him. This book is dedicated to David Wood, a great friend and total doofus. So I feel very, very happy about that. So it worked out well.
Thank you all for being here, ladies.
Bye-bye.